As you were told at the end of this morning's hearing, the next witness is anonymous and there will be no live streaming. He will be known to you and me as Mr. A.M. For those who are wondering whether that's an M or an N, it's Alpha Mike in phonetic. The order in his case is this. The name and address of witness W0125, that's Mr. A.M. to you and me, the name of any member of the witness's family, and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of his appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by me or by the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness 0125 must be referred to only as Mr. A.M. This order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered, and I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. Now that that order is in place, Mr. A.M., please.
Mr. A.M., your full name is known to the inquiry. Could you please take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
You have severe haemophilia A.
Yes.
As do your two brothers.
Yes, they do.
And your condition was diagnosed when you were a baby.
That's right, yes.
And most of your treatment during your childhood was at Great Ormond Street Hospital.
Yes.
If we have up on screen, please, Henry, 0125002, please. It should come up on the screen in front of you. We can have page 9. We can see there in the bottom half of the page, and this is from your UKHCDO database records, the treatments that you received in the course of the 1980s. So we have cryoprecipitate 1981 and 82, then factor 8 BPL and Oxford factor 8 in 1982, cryoprecipitate in 1983, Oxford factor 8 in 1983, and BPL factor 8 in 1983.
Yes.
And then insofar as 1984 and 1985 are concerned, and the significance of that we'll come back to, you're recorded as having received cryoprecipitate in 1984 at Great Ormond Street, factor 8 BPL in 1984 at Great Ormond Street,
yes,
and then Oxford factor 8 in 1985.
Yes.
And it was in 1984 that you went on to home treatment.
Yes, around then, yes.
Now, on the 30th of September of 1985, you tested positive for HIV.
Yes.
You were only 4 years old at the time. And if we keep this document up on screen, Henry, but go please to page 10, we can see in the top right-hand corner, date last negative, 15th of December 1984. And then if we go to the next page, page 11, please, you'll see in the top left-hand corner, date first positive, 30th of September 1985. I understand from your statement that your parents were not aware that you were being tested for HIV.
No, I don't believe they were.
They have become aware of another Great Ormond Street patient being diagnosed with HIV at the same time.
Yes.
And one inference that you suggested in your statement is that there may have been some form of systematic testing of patients going on.
Yes.
Now, you believe that the treatment which infected you was in all probability the BPL factor 8 you received in 1984.
Yes, you can see the window of opportunity for me to be infected can be narrowed from the earlier negative test. So between then and the positive test, there was, I think, only one treatment during then. So the likelihood is that that's when I was infected.
And one particular reason why, in all likelihood, it's the November 84 treatment, not an 85 treatment, is that one of your brothers was also given factor from the 1985 batch, but was not infected with HIV.
That's right, yes.
And the late 1984 batch, which was given to you for a bleed in your left elbow, is the one treatment within the relevant window which wasn't shared by any of your siblings.
That's right, yes. Back then, it's important to know that we were very careful about batches, and until even recently with haemophilia, we were very careful about batches because hospitals always told you never to mix the batch. Very occasionally, I think maybe once or twice, even with more modern treatment, I remember having a new batch and feeling a little unwell for an hour or so, dizzy, hot, that sort of thing. So you were strictly advised not to mix batches. So back then, it was even more tightly controlled and advised not to mix batches.
Now, by the time you were given Factor VIII in November of 1984, and putting the case at its lowest on the basis of evidence the inquiry's already heard, there is evidence to suggest that the risk of HIV from blood products was at least suspected.
Yes.
What, as far as you know, were your parents told about the risks of the product they were giving to their children?
I'm not aware they were. I'm not aware they were advised of any risks. I think probably like many, the majority of the information came through the media in a very different age to today, where obviously if something happens in America, you can find out within minutes here. That sort of information would have trickled through the print media, through television. So very little, if any, I think, were they told about it.
And we have a statement from your mother that was made in earlier litigation. And perhaps we'll put that on screen. It's 0125003, please, Henry. And if we go to the second page, we can see, if we go just a little bit further down the page, please, Henry. Thank you. We can see reference in that middle paragraph to the being towards the end of 1984. By that time, we were becoming anxious about AIDS. And then your mother makes reference to a meeting at Great Ormond Street. We don't know the precise date of the meeting from this statement, which says this: my recollection is that we were advised that the NHS unheated product was likely to be safer than the heated commercial product. And it's correct to say that we expressed a preference to stay on the unheated Lister product.
Yes.
So that's on the basis of advice that was being given to your parents at the time, based on this statement.
Yes, probably based on the donor source that we knew in America where the donations were coming from, but in the UK it was felt that because donations were given on a more voluntary basis, it was likely to have come from a safer source.
How did your parents learn of your diagnosis after this test that was carried out in September 85?
They were told very quickly. At the end of September, I think in early October, they were contacted by Great Ormond Street by the doctors and asked to come in. They said, I think something along the lines that one of the tests had come back and there was an irregularity about them, and they asked my parents to come in as soon as possible. My dad was working away at the time in Liverpool, and he flew back to London, and my parents went... Sorry.
Fine, take your time.
Take your time, and there's water if you want to drink it.
And they went to Great Ormond Street. They speculated as to which one of us it was who was ill. My mum knew that it was me because she said my glands had been up all year, so she knew it was likely to be me that the irregularity related to, and when she got there and they were told, she was right.
What were your parents told about your prognosis?
They were told I'd be lucky to make my 10th birthday.
Looking back, how did that diagnosis affect family life over the following years?
It's only with hindsight I can look back, because I wasn't told myself then. I was told later, which I'm sure we'll come to. Life was tough. Was it difficult? Yes, but my father worked, my mother didn't. Having 3 young boys with haemophilia was quite enough to cope with. So she didn't work and looked after us, because you never knew which one of us would be on crutches or in a wheelchair or need tending to at school, all those sorts of things. So Dad worked, he was self-employed, and coming to around the 90s, the recession hit. He worked in the building industry, and so things were incredibly difficult. But I think, understandably, my parents struggled to cope, as anyone would. My dad was diagnosed with depression, and had some was given medication for that, but because he was driving to and from work and it made him nauseous, then he had to stop. And that was back in 1986. And you can imagine working in a male-dominated environment must have been impossible to talk about. We look now, today, and we talk about things like mental health and the fact it's okay not to be okay, and the campaigns that are going on now. I can only imagine what my parents were dealing with back in the mid-80s, not really being able to have any support. So they struggled, and I think having read their statements from previous litigation, I know that my mum said effectively they were living separate lives.
And I'm just going to, if I may, read a couple of passages from those statements. Your mother, in her statement, said this: I have found it exceptionally hard to cope with the fact that you have been the unlucky one whilst his 2 brothers have mercifully been spared. After we found out about it, it had a devastating effect on our lives. My husband and I could not discuss it together, and we had to deal with it as best we could separately. I tried to keep cheerful and do things with the children, and he had to keep going with his work. And she talks about isolation and the devastating effect on lives. And at the point in time at which she gave that statement, you still hadn't been told yourself of the diagnosis.
That's right, yeah.
And she says this: my husband and I very much fear the day when we have to explain to him about his infection and how he will be able to cope with it. And your father, in his statement, talks about wrapping up all the problems internally and going through a very difficult time.
Yes.
You also say in your statement, looking back, that you think your parents, having been told in particular that you might be lucky to see your 10th birthday, tried to make sure you and your brothers had a good time.
Yes.
To go away and trying to give you the best of things.
That's right, yeah. We always had, so it was only my dad who worked. We always had good family holidays. I say we weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but we had the best of what they could afford.
How and when did you learn of your HIV diagnosis?
I learnt in the summer of 1993. I was 12 at the time, and I was just moving schools. I was going from the school system I was in had a so I was in middle school and I was about to go to secondary school. And one of my other brothers and I went to a hospital appointment at Great Ormond Street. And my dad came, which was highly unusual. Dad never came to the hospital. As I've said in the statement, he struggled to cope, like so many that we've heard at the inquiry, and many people buried their head in the sands, and I think that was, largely speaking, Dad's coping mechanism. So Dad came to the hospital, so I thought something was up. As I say, he was the breadwinner, he worked, so coming to hospital for a day meant him not working. And I remember being in the waiting area with my brother and my dad, and we were sat there for quite some time, I think probably well over an hour, and my mum had disappeared for a time. And then eventually I was taken into a room with one of the doctors and my nurse from Great Ormond Street. And I sat down and I didn't know what was going on, quite frankly, but it all happened relatively quickly, so I didn't have too much time to think about it. So they sat me down and they explained to me that I was HIV positive.
And can you recall what you thought and what, if anything, you said?
Immediately I burst into tears. It was a shock. I think my mum said in her statement, that a previous statement, that she thought I was the brightest out of the three of us, and she thought there might come the day when I worked things out and put two and two together and asked the question. If I did, they would inevitably tell me, but I didn't, because I was relatively fit and well, and so it was a complete shock to me. I broke down into tears straight away, and when I eventually recovered my composure, I think the first thing I said was, "Am I going to die?"
And can you recall what, if anything, by this time, the doctors were able to say to you about prognosis?
Probably more than what my parents were told, but probably less than what one might be told now. I wasn't necessarily given a prognosis of sorts, but I was told that obviously there was more treatment available, and I think my first HIV doctor, maybe my second HIV doctor, may have said similar things along the lines of the longer you stay alive, the more progress and research is being undertaken, and the better your life expectancy will be. We're obviously at a stage now where most people can expect to live a relatively normal and full life. So it was tentatively optimistic, I think, about my prognosis.
And you've said in your statement you felt very supported on the day you were told.
Yes.
This had been arranged between your parents and the hospital, that the news would be broken to you in this way.
Yes, it was no accident like others have found out.
And you said in your statement that after the initial response, you thought, I haven't known for 7 years and I've been okay, so why can't I continue to be okay? And you just carried on.
That was largely my mindset. I did have a few difficult days. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. And I don't know where that fortitude came from for a 12, 13-year-old either. But yes, that was my rationalisation of it, that I've been okay for 7 years, and why shouldn't I continue to be okay? So in a way, the fact that I'd not known to start with was a blessing.
And you've explained in your statement that in the year or 18 months following the communication of the diagnosis to you, you started to look back on the time before your diagnosis and to make sense of some things.
There were lots of things that I started to join the dots in relation to. As I said before, my mum thought there might be times when I realised what my diagnosis might have been and asked the questions, but I didn't. But with hindsight, I can see where the opportunities lay. I started on HIV medication when I was about 8 years old, and I remember vividly standing in the kitchen. It was, I think it was AZT, and it was in a syringe, and it didn't taste very nice, and I had to take it, and I said to my mum I didn't want to, and so she said, if you take it you can have a glass of Coke, and so I did, and that was that, and I carried on taking it. And then years later it turned into something else. But of course I was taking the medication and my two brothers weren't. So as I say, there was the first opportunity for me to say, well, why am I different to the other two? But it just never dawned on me. I was given spurious explanations as to why I was taking it. For example, I had lots of joint bleeds, and I think at one point I may have been told that as a result of that my blood had got a bit thicker, so I had to take this medication to help balance it out. So I was probably told various white lies to make sure I didn't work out what was going on. There were other things that, again, as I say, I joined the dots. I remember going to see the GP at various times with my brother, my younger brother and I, and at the end of the appointment at times, my brother and I would be asked to go and stand outside in the corridor, and I could hear the other side of the door my mum crying. And looking back, I realised that was because that was the only person she could talk to about it. That was the only other people who knew. There are other situations, I think, although a dark subject, it sounds almost ridiculous, but we'd have quite light-hearted conversations sometimes when in the car on journeys about, if you died, what would you want to happen to you? Do you want to be cremated or buried? And I always said that I wanted to be buried rather than cremated. I couldn't stand the idea of being cremated. And as I say, it was quite a light-hearted conversation, but with hindsight, it was clear. And my parents had planned my funeral with their own heads.
You also mention in your statement a few occasions where your mum would ask you if anyone had asked you about being blood brothers at school, because she was concerned that there might have been a sharing of blood.
Yeah.
You say she never told me why or told me not to do it, but it made sense why she asked in retrospect. On one occasion you almost said yes, just to see what her reaction would be. You also say you always would see 2 doctors when you went to Great Ormond Street in the
Yes.
years that followed your diagnosis. And you didn't. There was a haemophilia doctor. There was another doctor who was very nice, but you didn't know why she was there.
No, not in that sense. And that was normal. Every appointment I went to, I saw 2 doctors. And as I say, now I know that one was my haemophilia doctor and one was my HIV doctor. They had there was a special clinic downstairs at Great Ormond Street where all the boys who were infected with HIV would go. And what Great Ormond Street had done is they'd got an HIV doctor from the Mortimer Market Clinic in London who came over and regularly held clinics with the boys who were HIV positive to make sure they got the best care.
And then you've also recalled in your statement a time when you were about 10 years old, you had headaches and you were admitted to Great Ormond Street and had a lumbar puncture. Your parents are very upset.
Yes.
And it's only in retrospect that you understand why.
Yes, and obviously every parent's upset when their child's unwell, but I'd had headaches for about a month and I couldn't shift them and I was still going to school. And eventually they became excruciating. So we went to the hospital and they carried out various tests and it resulted in a lumbar puncture. And I think a small percentage of people then have back pain as a result of the lumbar puncture. And I had that back pain and I was bent double for about a week. I couldn't eat anything. Well, I could, but if I ate it, I would immediately bring it back up. So I was in hospital on a drip for a good week or so. I remember actually I went home for a time after the lumbar puncture, and then I think I've been playing in my bedroom with some Lego and bent over, and then that's when the pain really started. So I went back to Great Ormond Street where I was an inpatient for a week or so. I think my parents were always worried. They were always worried anyway because of my HIV, but that really caused them to worry.
During your childhood and teenagerhood, in terms of physical symptoms, you've described having swollen glands, oral thrush, but that was all relatively minor.
Yes.
But you recall that sometimes you would cry yourself to sleep thinking that you were going to die.
Yeah, a couple of times. As I say, it wasn't all... I didn't come to that realisation quickly. I think of the first few months, there were some dark times when I was worried, and I think I said in my statement, I remember back to people like Freddie Mercury, who died in 1991, which was incredibly recent, and in terms of when I'd just been told about my diagnosis. So it was, you'd think, well, if someone like that, who presumably with all the money he had, and he could have been, he would have been able to get private healthcare with effectively the best healthcare in the world, he still succumbed to it. So that was something that was a constant reminder, and I suppose sort of Freddie Mercury and Queen music generally, that it sums up, I think, what a lot of people feel about what's happened to them. And sort of one of the lyrics talks about, "I've served my sentence but committed no crime." I think many people feel like that. You
later learnt that you'd also been affected with hepatitis C.
Yes.
Can you recall anything about that?
No. I don't know when I was told I had hepatitis C, and neither does my mum, and neither does she, in relation to my other siblings. And I simply don't know when that happened. And as crazy as that sounds, because of course if you were told, you would like to think you'd remember, but I think in the scheme of everything, HIV, hepatitis, haemophilia, you put it in that hierarchy. So, and later on, things like variant CJD as well will be somewhere down the bottom of the list compared to everything else that you were told about. So I'm not sure if it's something that I was specifically told about at some point, or my parents were, and it paled into insignificance because of my initial diagnosis. But no, my parents don't remember and I don't remember. I remember when I moved my care from Great Ormond Street to the Mortimer Market Clinic for my HIV, at some point having a conversation with my doctor about it and then receiving treatment later on.
And you've since noted in your medical records, in around 1984, a record of abnormal liver function tests.
Yes.
You don't, as far as you're aware, nothing was mentioned at the time to your parents about hepatitis?
No, you saw from the UK HCDO record there's two hospitals mentioned, Great Ormond Street and Wexham Park, and in my medical records there's a letter from Great Ormond Street to Wexham Park Hospital with my ALT level, which is significantly elevated, but that may or may not be an initial indication of hepatitis C at the time, and that was in April 1984. But as far as I'm aware, there was certainly no conversation with my parents prior to them learning of my HIV diagnosis that I may or may not have been infected with what would have then been non-A, non-B hepatitis.
And at a later stage, what, if anything, did you learn about the risk of VCJD?
I was written to, like most people, I think, in 2004 to advise that you may have been exposed to variant CJD, and I think from memory I probably was. But again, it paled into insignificance with my other diagnoses.
Now, how was your health physically during your teens and adulthood, and what treatments did you receive for HIV?
My health was good, despite everything. If anything, my haemophilia has caused me more problems and issue than certainly my HIV and hepatitis. In terms of joint damage, I can't touch my left shoulder. Both my ankles are severely arthritic. Initially, we talk a lot about CD4 counts and viral loads for those people with HIV, and I had no CD4 count whatsoever, which was one of the reasons why my parents were so incredibly worried about me getting ill, things like chickenpox at school, for example. So I had no CD4 count whatsoever, so I wasn't able to fight off any sort of viral infections. And my viral load, I'm not sure they're even testing it then. But when I moved on from the liquid AZT to tablets in AZT, and then I think I went through several different medications. One was called DDI, which was it was a tablet which was dissolved in a bottle of water. And then I moved on to triple therapy, 3 different tablets, I think twice a day then. I now take triple therapy once a day. And around the age of 17, I started to develop a CD4 count. So rather than get ill, I actually started to get better. At the time, I had a lot of warts, or a couple on, or maybe 4 or 5 on my hands, and a lot on one of my big toes and on my feet. And I'd been sent to the dermatology clinic. I'd had them frozen with liquid nitrogen, and that didn't work. But I started on this new medication. I started to get a CD4 count, and my warts disappeared almost overnight. And so it was apparent to me that I was seemingly, with the medication, getting better.
You did, I think, have a reaction to one HIV drug with a rash all over your body in your childhood.
Yes, 3TC. It was a little diamond tablet. It was either that or a jar of chicken tonight, which Mum cooked for dinner. Either way, we didn't have chicken tonight again for dinner, which was a bonus. So, but yes, we think it was a 3TC.
You had an occasion during your adulthood where you thought for a period of time that your HIV may have developed into AIDS. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, in around, I think from memory, around 2004, I had a mole on my back just by my right scapula, and I'd been on holiday and it had started to hurt. Obviously I couldn't see it myself, so I couldn't tell whether it got bigger at all. But it started to hurt and be a bit painful, so I again was referred to the dermatology clinic. By this time I was at University College Hospital, and I was referred to the dermatology clinic, and I went to have it removed under local anaesthetic. And the registrar who'd removed it told me at the time when he removed it that he thought it was a lesion. I forgot that. You'll be able to prompt me, I'm sure.
Kaposi sarcoma?
Kaposi sarcoma, thank you. A Kaposi sarcoma lesion, which meant nothing to me. And I was then to go back 2 weeks later for a follow-up appointment. 2 days later, I happened to be doing some summer work at a particular place, and I was reading some papers in relation to something. And there was somebody I was reading about who also had HIV and also had Kaposi sarcoma. And the doctor had written in his notes that meant that his HIV had progressed to a diagnosis of AIDS. I went home that night. I was still living at home with my parents, and I went home that night and spoke to my mum, who'd been at the appointment with me. And she understood the import of what the doctor had said when he said it. But she hadn't told me so as not to worry me. But I then had 12 days thinking that I'd progressed from having HIV to AIDS, which was, of course, an absolutely petrifying time. I went back to that appointment and I saw a different doctor, a different registrar, who told me that it was benign and there was nothing to worry about. But it was quite clear that the doctor, the new doctor, as it were, the one I hadn't seen previously, apologised to me, because it was quite clear what the doctor had done is he'd seen the lesion, seen my diagnosis, and added 2 and 2 together and came up with 5. But that didn't help me at the time.
Did your parents tell many other people of your infection?
No, it was a secret. Felt like a dark and guilty secret, but no, it was our family secret and still largely is. There are very few people who know.
And that remains the case to this day.
Yes.
And this is probably the first time you've spoken publicly.
Yes.
About what you're describing. You've explained in your statement that you yourself first told somebody that you had HIV. As a teenager, you told your first girlfriend and your best friend around the same time.
Yes, I was about 16, so I told my first girlfriend and my best friend.
And what was their response?
Didn't bat an eyelid. They were teenagers and they just got on with life.
And in terms of your work life, you don't tell people that you're HIV positive.
No.
You explain in your statement that merely disclosing the fact of your haemophilia in early years had led to discrimination, to you not getting work.
Yes, my brother and I were both applying for weekend jobs at the time. We were teenagers and wanted a bit of part-time work and some money in our pockets so we could go out with friends. And we were both applying for jobs, and we'd fill out forms, and under the disability section at the end we'd put we had haemophilia, and we wouldn't hear a thing back. We wouldn't get a letter, a phone call, nothing. And you might think once or twice that your application form got lost or there was someone better, but after 4 or 5 times you start to realise that there's a reason they're not getting back to you. So we both decided to apply for a job and not put on our haemophilia diagnosis, and 2 days later we both had a job.
And it's that experience and your own wider knowledge of the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS that has led you not to tell people about that. You've described in your statement an incident in the course of your working life when you overheard a discussion about someone with HIV or AIDS. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, there was a client I was supposed to meet in my working life, and there was some other people who knew about that client, and they were speaking about his diagnosis quite freely in front of me, not in front of him. But then when I was due to see him, they made various comments to me about being careful, etc., which I internally laughed at. So because I obviously knew that my diagnosis was the same as his.
And you've said this in your statement: my experience has done nothing to disabuse me of the notion that attitudes towards the virus had or were changing.
Yes.
In terms of
attitudes weren't.
Yes, I'm
Yes.
sorry.
I think that's what you meant to say.
Yes.
In terms of your personal and family life, you met your wife whilst you were still a student, a university student.
Yes, I was at the end of my first year at university.
And you later married. Your wife was fully aware of your HIV diagnosis. But you then came a time when you discussed having children. What process did you go through?
We went through the only process that you could really at the time, which was sperm washing. And we were fortunate on the one hand to be living in London, and the only place that I'm aware in the country that did sperm washing was the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. And we had to go to, I spoke to my HIV doctor about it, who then referred me to the GP, because we then had to go and make an application to our local London borough at the time for funding. And we eventually did get funding, and we went through a round of sperm washing at the Chelsea and Westminster.
That was not successful.
No, it wasn't. And one of the side effects of the HIV medication can be that it reduces significantly your sperm count. So no, it was unsuccessful the first time.
And then you had difficulty, or you weren't able to obtain funding for any further rounds because of a change in NICE guidance. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think initially we decided that we weren't going to make it to go through a second round of applications. I think the first time you apply, it's almost a given that you will get it. But the second time, it's, I think, a bit more of a battle. And my wife and I always took the decision that having children was never something that was going to make or break us. We were together for each other rather than having children necessarily. And so it was around 2008. I remember going to see my HIV doctor, and I think he mentioned it first, or I may have read it in the press before, but at the time there was something that became known as the Swiss Statement in 2008, and the Swiss Statement was a statement by a number of Swiss doctors about the fact that if you had an undetectable viral load, then you couldn't pass it on. We're now, of course, talking about the U=U campaign. And it was relevant, I think, mainly in Switzerland because of the law in relation to criminal law about whether or not you could consent to being infected with HIV effectively, and people having sexual relationships. And so it was of interest in that respect, and the NICE guidelines changed, and it felt contradictory in the sense that it still said that if one of you was infected, you should have protected sexual intercourse, but it also said that if you wanted to conceive children, then you should consider doing it naturally.
And you've understood that would be problematic in terms of obtaining any further funding for any further rounds of sperm washing?
Yes, I think that was part of that. I mean, that was obviously a limiting factor in any consideration for any further funding.
And you've said this in your statement: it felt cruel that we were not able to conceive children naturally due to NHS treatment, but then would have to fund anything more than one round of treatment.
Yes.
You also, in your statement, in discussing the practical impact of stigma, talked about issues relating to travel to the USA. What can you tell us about that?
I think that's probably where I've experienced the most stigma in relation to HIV. I think I've been to the US, maybe as a child I went a couple of times with my family, but knew nothing of what was going on. And back then my parents would have had to apply for a visa for me to enter the country. When Barack Obama was president, he changed the law in America in relation to people with HIV having to apply for visas. So I no longer had to apply. But there was one occasion before the law change where I was in my early 20s. My best friend had been off travelling around the world for several months, and I was just about to start a new job, and I'd agreed that I was going to go out to meet him in Los Angeles for a couple of weeks, and for us to meet up and have a bit of a holiday before I sort of settled down with work. And I had to go to the American Embassy for an application. It was just before the summer, and when I got there were lots of other people in their early 20s. They were going on sports camps and the like, so were applying for visas, and they were sat in the waiting room. And I was petrified that people were going to ask me why I was there, where was I going, what fun was I off to have, etc., and why was I getting my visa and things. So I kept my head down. I think I might have had a newspaper with me and just buried my head in the newspaper. And then when I did go through, I had an interview with an immigration officer from the US, and it felt like a police interview. They asked me a series of questions, and then they started again and asked me the same series of questions to see whether or not I gave a different answer. Then when I don't think I had any issues when I entered the US that time, but on other times when my wife and I have been, although I don't need a visa anymore, when I go, there's always a marker on my passport. So when I went to New York, I remember spending about an hour trying to get through customs. I was immediately, my passport, they didn't let me through. I was taken off into a room. My passport was taken away. They carried out various investigations. Didn't really say much or anything to me. And I eventually said to them, "Is this why you're checking? Because there's a marker on there." And they said, "Yes, there is." But I think the worst experience was when my wife and I were in Canada and then went to the US. We'd been travelling to see some family, then been to Vancouver and over to Victoria Island. And when we were there, we got the boat from Victoria to Seattle. And the procedure is that you clear US customs before getting to Seattle, so you get straight off the boat and then can get on with the rest of your holiday. And my wife and I got there early because the boat trip itself is part of the journey, in the sense there's whales and dolphins and nice things to see. So we thought we'll get there early and try and get a good seat on the boat and sit near the window. And so we did, and I think we were one of the first ones there, but we were the last ones on the boat. Because again, there was a marker on my passport. I was taken off, pulled into a separate room with my wife. There was another man sat there who was Australian. He'd, I think, in some sort of search, he tested positive for gamma radiation because he had terminal cancer, and he was on a round-the-world tour with his wife before he eventually died, so he was in the room as well. There was no privacy whatsoever. We both knew, not that either of us were going to go and shout about each other's diagnosis, but we both knew exactly the other person's diagnosis, and we sat there like criminals in a police station custody suite. It was horrific. And having been, as I say, the first ones there, we were then the last ones on the boat, and don't think we got a seat, if at all, and it soured what had been otherwise a very good holiday.
In terms of medical care, what effect has the potential exposure to the risk of VCJD had, if any, on medical care that you've received?
It's had an impact. One particular example, I've had two inguinal hernias, and the first time I had the operation at the Royal Free Hospital, it took place without incident. The second time I had it, I'd been for my preliminary appointment and seen the consultant, and on the day, I think his registrar was carrying out the surgery. And I'd gone in on the Thursday night. I'm self-employed, and so I'd deliberately taken time off work and managed my diary. Because of my haemophilia, I knew that unlike most people who have hernia operations who can go in and out in the same day, I would have to stay in for a couple of days to have my factor VIII levels monitored. So I'd deliberately done it with the weekend in mind so as not to miss work. I was woken up in the small hours of the morning by the phlebotomist and had a cannula put in me, which even as a haemophiliac, having injected myself thousands of times, it's never a pleasant experience, especially at that time of the morning. And then at 8 o'clock, I'd been nil by mouth since the night before. The registrar came round to inspect my hernia and said to me that I was going to be first down the next morning in terms of surgery, which I thought was quite unusual because I think most other people at the inquiry have talked about being the last one down because of their infection, but for whatever reason I was put to the front of the list. And he said, you'll be down shortly around 8:30. So 8:30 came and went, 9 o'clock came and went, and by this time I was starting to get a bit anxious and wondering why I hadn't been taken down to surgery. I spoke to one of the nurses and she said, I don't think you're going to be taken down now. And I said, do you know why not? And she said, no. She said, but let me try and speak to the surgeon. And by this time I was getting quite angry because I felt I was being fobbed off. And I demanded to see the surgeon, and I was told you can't, he's in surgery. So in my gown, I think with the cannula in, I walked off the ward and I walked down to the haemophilia centre. And I walked in and I spoke to my doctor there and I said, I'm being taken for a fool upstairs. I said, you need to go and find out what's going on, please. And it transpired that the reason I wasn't being, or at least the reason I was told I wasn't being taken down for the surgery is because the Royal Free didn't have any disposable equipment to carry out my operation that day. And so I would be sent home and my operation would be rescheduled. I subsequently spoke to my HIV doctor about that, and he didn't accept that for a moment. He's a very mild-mannered man, but he said, I don't believe for a second that a major hospital in London like that did not have the equipment to carry out the operation on me. I suspect that the registrar, he was struggling to find the hernia. The consultant had found it, but the registrar was struggling when he came to see me. And my feeling is that he was scared to operate on a haemophiliac, not being able to find the hernia, but at least the ostensible reason I was given for the operation was that they didn't have disposable equipment for the operation.
Your treatment for your HIV over the years, you say in your statement, has been very good.
It's been excellent.
And you have said you wished others had been as fortunate in that respect. You've identified two particular respects in which your HIV care has been good. First, as you've already alluded to, you had specialist HIV care from an early age,
Yes.
rather than simply being cared for by a haematologist for your HIV.
Yes. The haemophilia doctors at Great Ormond Street, well, I understand from my mother, were incredibly proactive about getting that care. As I said, it wasn't just someone else from the hospital. They got in a specialist HIV doctor from the Mortimer Market Centre. And they set up a specialist clinic for all the boys at Great Ormond Street who were infected to be treated and looked after and to fight to get the first medication that came to them.
And that's continued over the years. You've had specialist HIV care.
Yes, I have the option of having my HIV care at the Royal Free Hospital, but I choose not to. I go to a specialist HIV centre for it.
And a second factor about your care identified in your statement is the continuity of care you've had, especially for your HIV. You've only ever really seen, I think, 2 doctors.
Yes, and my second doctor's about to retire, which shows you how long I've been with him. So, yes.
What was your experience of treatment for hepatitis C?
My hepatitis C treatment was also treated through the Mortimer Market Centre through my doctor there, Dr. Ian Williams, and the hepatitis C medication was horrific. I had my first injection at the clinic. I went there on a Friday morning to be injected. I then went to work that day. and I went out that evening. I'd been warned about the side effects and how debilitating and crippling they were, but I'd also been given several other warnings prior to other medication, and none of the side effects had really materialised. So I think there was probably an element of naivety from me that I felt that it's fine, you just have to tell me all these things, and none of them are actually going to, or not many of them are actually going to be real. But it was horrific. I was out in central London at the time, and it was about 8 o'clock when it just came over me. And I was living in southwest London at the time, and I just had to hail a black cab and get in the back of a cab and get home. And when I got home, I got undressed and I got into bed, and it's impossible to explain to somebody who's never experienced it, really. It's the worst flu you've ever had multiplied by 10. I was hot, I was cold, I felt sick, I felt suicidal, all in one night. I think it was quite a warm evening, but there would be times where I'd be under the duvet shivering, and then there would be times when I'd have the duvet off and be wearing hardly anything, and I'd be sweating. I couldn't eat. I struggled to sleep. And my wife effectively nursed me, and on Monday morning I got up and went to work.
And you've said in your statement, and I think this was around 2006 that you had this treatment, you would inject the treatment at home after that first weekend on a Friday evening. You'd be ill for the weekend.
Yes.
You'd just about to start functioning by the Sunday, and then you'd try and get to work on the Monday and work through to the Friday again.
The nature of my work meant that I always had preparation to do over the weekend, and so on a Sunday I'd need to prepare, and as you say, I'd be just about functioning. On Monday I'd still feel ill, but I was self-employed, I had no choice.
And you took that treatment for how long?
About 6 months, I think.
You did clear hepatitis C after that first round of treatment.
Yes.
But you say in your statement that you realise, and it's only through hearing evidence that you've heard during this inquiry, you realise that you have continued to suffer with brain fog and memory issues.
Yes, lots of people have spoken about that. I used to have an incredibly sharp memory, being able to remember names, faces, where I'd met people, but now, last night, for example, I went out to dinner with my wife, and I can tell you what food we had and roughly where it was, but I can't tell you the name of the restaurant. Those sorts of things just escape me, and it's only after several times of maybe doing something or being somewhere that I'll eventually remember the name of where I was or that sort of thing.
To what extent has counselling or psychological support been made available to you?
I think there are probably two aspects to that. When I was at Great Ormond Street, again, Great Ormond Street had a counsellor, a lovely lady called Candy Duggan, and for much of the time I didn't know that she was a counsellor, and I spoke to her, but it wasn't, I wouldn't describe it as a formal counselling session where I went in, it was a case of, right, we're going to sit down and talk about things. It was a general friendly chat to see how things were going, that sort of thing. And I know that, I think one piece I haven't mentioned previously, but when I was at Great Ormond Street, I know I was monitored and tested because of my HIV. So, for example, there were various psychological testing that took place with my parents' consent, obviously, and I had CT scans on my brain and things to monitor me. When I had my hepatitis C treatment, I think I was offered counselling before that by my doctor, Dr. Ian Williams, and I think maybe once or twice afterwards, but it was never something I felt I wanted or needed. I remember another witness saying previously that he felt counselling should have almost been something that was thrust upon you, and I think I wouldn't disagree with that. I think it's something that undoubtedly does help, but it was offered to me, but not overly, not persistently, but it was there if I wanted it.
In terms of your parents, who were told in the 1980s that their 4-year-old had HIV, were they offered any form of counselling or psychological or other support?
I don't think directly, no. I think they, like so much of the NHS, one part was left to fill in for the other. I think the haemophilia doctors did most of it. I know that when my dad was suffering from depression, it was a conversation with the haemophilia doctor at Great Ormond Street that helped him to then go and see somebody about it. So I don't think they were ever formally offered anything, no.
Your parents participated in the group litigation, the HIV litigation.
Yes.
What's your understanding and view of the way in which that litigation was compromised, having spoken, I think, to your parents about this issue?
Yes, my parents were at lots of the meetings in London, and it was, from what I understand, those meetings were incredibly difficult because on the one hand you had young boys, and they were boys, who were dying, who were being promised this money from the government, and on the other hand you had people like my parents who had a young son for who, to a degree, they could provide for and care for and look after, who wanted to go to court and seek a better settlement in relation to everyone's infections. And I think the words I'm sure have been used before, but there was a form of emotional blackmail that went on in all of this, and that it wasn't just government pressuring the people into accepting it. It was because of that promise that was being held out to those people were indirectly putting pressure on the others who wanted to remain resolute and say no. And my mum firmly believes that if the waiver hadn't been signed back then, we probably wouldn't be where we are now.
And then you, I think, a number of years later, approached solicitors about the possibility of challenging the waiver. Mm-hmm. And what were you advised?
The solicitor that represented my parents at the time, I was going to be one of the test cases when the case went to court, because it was thought that I was infected through British product rather than American product. And the solicitor had since left the firm of solicitors and I think was teaching in Nottingham, and I contacted him about challenging the waiver, but his advice to me was that there was no way to challenge the waiver. And
you've termed the way in which the litigation was compromised with the waiver in your statement in this way a disgraceful sleight of hand.
Yes. Especially with the hepatitis C infection. The fact that was added so late on, seemingly, when people didn't know of the fact that they were infected or the extent or the potential damage that would have caused.
You applied, I think, only once to the Macfarlane Trust for a discretionary payment.
Yes.
That was for a laptop for study or work-related reasons. Mm-hmm. What was the response from the Macfarlane Trust?
Reluctantly, they gave me the money. They said that they knew how much people in earn, so don't be asking again, effectively.
And you've described that again as disgraceful. You were made to feel guilty for asking for anything.
Yes, I'd despite everything that had gone on, I'd gone to university, I'd studied, I'd worked hard, and I'd achieved well, I thought. And despite all of that, they simply said to me, don't ask again, effectively.
Your witness statement says that you have, by and large, been fit and well.
Yes.
And that you have tried to live your life by looking forward. But also this, appreciating as you do that you're lucky to be alive and fortunate, you say, in some respects in terms of the care you've received. Living with my infection is like having a constant cloud hanging over.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. I think despite everything, so many people have described themselves as lucky, and I think I was discussing this with my parents and family recently, and I described myself as one of the lucky, unlucky ones.
Those are the questions I have for you. I'm just going to ask Ms. Gollop if she's got any further questions. No, there's nothing further, but is there anything more that you would like to say?
Just one or two bits. I won't be particularly long. It's become customary, I think, Sir Brian, for people to make some closing remarks, and I don't want to shy away from that custom.
It's not obligatory.
No, I know. I want to start by publicly saying thank you to several people. First and foremost to my parents. I can't begin to imagine what you've gone through. And your strength and courage continue to inspire me. I dare say you often ask yourselves if you did the right thing, and the answer to that is a resounding yes. And next to my brothers, growing up wasn't always easy, and at times we had to grow up a little quicker than others. It was always fun and continues to be. So thank you for being there. And then to my wife, many would have run the other way. You ran into my arms. And I still ask myself why. And I'm forever grateful that you did. Words can't express my gratitude to you, so I'll simply say thank you. There are many healthcare professionals that I would like to publicly say thank you to, but due to my anonymity, they would never hear it. There are many doctors, nurses, physios and others who have got me to where I am, and one of the great things about the haemophilia community is that because it's a lifelong condition, many of those people also become friends, and it's my privilege to know them all. I want to turn then to what I call my piece of the jigsaw, and I hope you'll forgive me, Sir Brian, for trespassing on what might be considered exclusively your territory, but something I've struggled with whilst listening to others give evidence is where my piece of the jigsaw fits, and I wanted to make some observations about how I feel my account fits into the bigger picture of the inquiry generally. So many people have given evidence of how they have been let down and the catastrophic impact that it's had on their life. Whilst my story is not all good, overwhelmingly I've had a good experience in terms of a response to what happened, which begs the question, what should have happened? In my view, a comprehensive database of those infected should have been set up. Haemophiliacs should have been systematically tested and a comprehensive look-back exercise undertaken to ascertain those infected from the whole blood community. Specialist clinics should then have been developed with the leading experts treating those infected, experts in HIV, experts in hepatitis, counsellors, dentists and anything else the infected was struggling to cope with. Had that happened, I firmly believe many more people could have ended up in my position, namely having been able to lead a fulfilled life despite the devastating infection which had befallen them. I'm not naive enough to think all could have been saved, but undoubtedly many more should be in a better position than they are. In terms of where I believe my piece of the jigsaw sits, I believe I am an example of what could have been achieved had a coordinated, compassionate and comprehensive response been instigated. Instead, what happened was the most egregious dereliction of duty by a country to its citizens in modern times. Government made a vulnerable community more vulnerable with deadly infections. Whether that could and should have been prevented is a matter for this inquiry. What's abundantly clear, however, is that government's response was worse than mere apathy. Government actively compounded our community's plight with campaigns such as the AIDS Tombstone campaign. Much is talked about in relation to money and compensation. Many people who had money have spent it filling the gaps left by a lack of government response, on hepatitis treatment, for example. But what we as a community want is about so much more than money. Day after day, week after week, the inquiry's heard accounts of people's personal battles with their viruses. In reality, we've been waging a war, not just against our viruses, but against government. Government has tried to subdue us, they continue to ignore us, and they continue to do battle with us. Why? Where is their recognition of our struggle? We today see the public health campaign U equals U, meaning undetectable means untransmittable in relation to HIV. We all remember those Tombstone adverts, and we should now be celebrating the U equals U campaign, and its principal champion should be government. They should be endeavouring to undo large aspects of the harm they themselves created. But instead, it's left to charities like the Terence Higgins Trust to promote such news. Again, where is our government in all of this? We are tired of meaningless apologies. We are tired of platitudes in relation to this being something that should never have happened. As a community, in future, we will judge you by what you do, not by what you say. If you want a list, here's a starter for 3. Start a public health campaign backed by government in relation to U equals U. Secondly, level out the support payments across the UK as a matter of urgency by the end of this year at the very latest. Thirdly, start a look-back campaign now. Do not wait until the end of the inquiry. More lives will have been lost if you do. And then I turn to my country and I ask, why have you forsaken us? Sir Brian, you said last week in your opening comments that no one could fail to be moved by what they have heard. Sadly, I don't believe enough politicians are listening. When Diana Johnson MP writes to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is a letter received from Oliver Dowden MP. Is the death of over 3,000 of his country's citizens not important enough for the Prime Minister to respond? I don't believe it's an accident that when David Lidington was Cabinet Office Minister and attended the opening last September, he remained engaged. Politicians must engage now. But not just politicians, our royal family and celebrities. With some notable exceptions, politicians of all hues have ignored our plight for decades. But not just politicians. Why have our royal family never acknowledged this immense tragedy? Haemophilia is known as the royal disease. Why the dis-ease about acknowledging us? Perhaps the Queen will see fit to mention us in her Christmas speech this year. Perhaps Princes William or Harry would like to meet some of the victims of this tragedy and gain a true understanding of the stigma our community has endured. And celebrities who use their profile to try and end the stigma around HIV. Why has no one ever championed our cause? Why have we have no celebrities queuing up to write a song and raise money to support our community, or to highlight our profile to the public, or to ensure we are at the top of the political agenda? Only last weekend, Sir Elton John said, the traumatic thing is still the stigma. As a community, we seem to have a stigma all of our own. Lastly, money. Since July, I've been in receipt of the higher rate of payments from the English infected blood support schemes. I now work part-time, and at the moment that is becoming somewhat of a part-time job for which I'm not allowed to be remunerated. The additional payments have given me a significant amount of breathing space in terms of being able to balance my work with the other demands on my life. The impact for others who have not been as fortunate as me is surely immeasurable. Why then does government continue to ignore the plight of those in Wales and Northern Ireland in particular? What happened on the Westminster government's watch. Westminster must respond. Whilst health may be devolved, responsibility cannot. It's further evidence of government's lack of humanity, which is in stark contrast to that shown by you, Sir Brian, and your team. The manner in which we've been treated by you and your team has been exemplary. The hearings themselves are so much more than allowing people to tell their personal stories. They've allowed people to come together and share experiences they thought only they had been through. Alongside the recognition it provides, it's allowed people to realise they are not alone. There will be more difficult times ahead, but I feel we're in safe hands. So finally, let me thank you, Sir Brian, and all of your incredible team.
Thank you.
Can I, before I respond to your thanks to us, just ask you one question, if I may? Despite the clarity of everything else that you said, there was one expression you used which was a little Delphic. It was your mother's saying to you, if things had been different, we wouldn't be where we are now. What do you think she meant by that?
I think she feels that if people hadn't signed the waiver and things had gone to court, things wouldn't be as bad for the community as they are now. I think she feels that had the case eventually gone to court and been litigated, then people would have been in a better position now.
So she would have been looking to the litigation and to success in the litigation, and that's what she had in mind?
Yes, and of course it then wouldn't have barred any further claims in relation to hepatitis as well, which was one of the big issues which transpired after that.
Thank you for that. It remains for me to thank you, and particular thanks, I think, because you've delivered a very clear account, and indeed made at the very end those very clear recommendations, the comprehensive, coordinated, compassionate and comprehensive response that you were calling for. And I've heard that, and I shall remember that, even if I had difficulty with putting the words in the right order a moment ago. But in particular thanks, because it's obvious that you've managed to give us a very clear account, despite the emotional rawness which this has to you, and despite what is obviously, as you put it, a very private family matter, although I see the front row who are here to support you. And that makes it all the more courageous for you to feel, I think, that it was your responsibility to come, rather than your pleasure, to tell us about what you have. So thank you. We will hear our next witness at 3 o'clock.
Yes, sir.
3 o'clock.